Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast. That is, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot with my colleagues Kim Strassel and Colin Levy. Let's turn to another subject in the news this weekend, the Supreme Court of the United States, and in particular, a weekend story in the New York Times, clear leaks from inside the court claiming that Chief Justice John Roberts had shaped 3 cases last year to help Donald Trump. That's not my spin. That's the way their headline put it. The story contained information about a memo from Chief Justice Roberts to his colleagues from February of 2024, in which he wrote to his colleagues saying that he wanted to take up the immunity case, the challenge on presidential immunity as part of the Jack Smith prosecution of Donald Trump, follow-up notes from Justices Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh, and then accounts of conversations among the justices at their private conference when they discussed the immunity case. Now, just so people understand, that's a meeting where it's justices only. They talk about the case, the oral arguments, and they give an idea to their colleagues about where they're going to come out on the case. No clerks usually allowed there. This suggests to me that the information came, at least at some point, from one or more of the justices, whether or not those justices talked directly to the New York Times reporters. Clearly, the information came in the first instance from one of those in that room. Colin, what do you make of all this?
Honestly, Paul, I think it's hard to capture how damaging this leak is, because it really does suggest a cracking in what has been up until now a nearly impenetrable bastion of collegiality and professionalism and respect among the justices. Now, of course, we hear mutterings here and there, but they've protected that fairly well. So that means that for decades, the Supreme Court was really, as the founders intended, as something of a different animal than the other 2 branches, somewhat outside the political melee. You know, there's a reason why Supreme Court justices serve life terms, because it gives them an element of independence from the political push and pull. And, you know, I'd add that so many of the stories of the Supreme Court going back decades are really a testament to that. Most famously, the relationship between the late Justices Antonin Scalia and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. You know, those were 2 long-serving justices, completely different perspectives on the Constitution, and yet famously collegial. And this is really breaking that. And as it pertains to Roberts, I have to say, I think it's a particular shame that this attack is landing on him, because I think one of the defining elements of his tenure on the court has been an effort to find consensus among the justices and look for ways that opinions can be decided to garner broad support. So it's really a preposterous allegation that he would somehow be in the tank for Donald Trump or trying to create an outcome-driven opinion here. As far as I can tell, that was precisely what he was doing here, as always, you know, with the awareness, maybe even of the political tinderbox, to try to find some consensus on basic constitutional principles and ensure that the court's decision would have integrity of thought and as much support as he could get for it. That's what he's supposed to do.
Of course, we did have the leak of the Dobbs draft opinion, the Dobbs case being the abortion case in 2022. That was a tremendous breach of confidentiality as well. But that could have been a clerk, could have been some functionary at the court. The court still has not found out who that was. The information clearly had to start, at least in the first instance. We don't know the chain of information, obviously, but in the first instance had to start with a justice, because it was in a private meeting where only the justices meet. And then these private memos leaking and notes and conversations are something else to get out there. And just as the Supreme Court is about to start its new term, Kim, in October, and it's the New York Times story spun from the point of view of the critics of the court and of Roberts, particularly the point of view of Justice Sonia Sotomayor, from what she has said in her dissents and what she has said in public about how painful it is for her to be in the minority on so many of these major cases. My main criticism of the Times article is it is written from that point of view without the caveats of the kind that Colin mentioned. For example, the idea that John Roberts wanted to wade into this Trump docket, as we call it, these Trump cases, is I think, silly. He'd want to stay far away from them, those cases, but the court couldn't dodge them. after these moved up the chain of appellate rulings.
Well, and that's the other caveat is how did we get here? And that was just completely ignored in this piece. I mean, we're here because Democrats chose to turn the legal system against Donald Trump with a campaign of lawfare with these suits, some of which, by the way, were over the top. I think the one that I would point out in that regard was Trump v. Anderson, and that was the one in which the Colorado Supreme Court decided it was going to bar Trump from the ballot under the 14th Amendment on grounds of sedition, a ruling that, had it been allowed to stand, would have allowed every state to create their own patchwork of decisions about who could or could not be on the federal ballot. Of course, the Supreme Court had to weigh in on that. And I would note, by the way, that the ultimate decision was 9-0, overruling that because everyone understood that they were going to have to go there. But these cases, many of them, they were brought by Democrats, then they were actively pushed up the appellate system. And then suddenly here the Supreme Court goes to do its job, which is to settle these very thorny disputes. What else can they do? And the left is shocked that they're actually doing what our system is designed for the Supreme Court to do. I mean, in some of these, by the way, too, these were very pressing legal questions, and the immunity one is a very good example of that. I appreciate that Justice Sotomayor was not happy with the way that that ruling came out in the end. But let me point out that we had a decision back in 1982, Nixon v. Fitzgerald, which defined the limits of presidential immunity when it came to civil lawsuits. It was always understood that we might have to spool that out and decide the question of what happens if someone actually targets a president criminally. Look, in my mind, it would have been great if that day had never come. But Democrats made that day come with these Jack Smith prosecutions against the president. So without that context in this piece, I think it's a very unfair burden to suggest that John Roberts or the conservative court somehow was stepping into a place it shouldn't have stepped, and even more outrageous to then suggest they were doing it for partisan purposes.
And of course, this is part of a larger campaign. The Times piece fits in nicely into this larger campaign of progressives to attack the credibility of this court and indeed to promote changes to the court that would jeopardize its judicial independence. Some of it is masked under so-called ethics or recusal standards that would be enforced by outside bodies or lower court judges. And it's somewhat dismaying to me to have heard separately from this story. Elena Kagan, Justice Kagan, and Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson have both said that they are open to that kind of enforceable ethics code, which strikes me as very dangerous for the court. Colin, you're going to get the last word here, but I have to say, this is just as a simple matter of collegiality. You go into a room, you expect your colleagues to abide by the rules and not talk about what you said or she said or they said.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, of course, that was the intention here along the lines of what you're talking about with the broader campaign about the ethics of the Supreme Court. Of course, it was the intention to impugn the motives of the Chief Justice because he's the one who has in some ways floated a bit above the fray. So trying to take him down is no doubt a part of that campaign. I also want to address this core notion that Roberts was using some kind of leverage here for his supposedly Trumpian agenda. It's a ridiculous claim because this Times story is sensational with this artwork with big rips of red, as though he was somehow trashing the Constitution or the notion of the court. But again, Paul, the idea of justices trying to persuade each other formally or informally is not news. That's what justices and judges on circuit courts across the country have always done. That is, in fact, what they're supposed to do. They're great minds. They're meant to interact with each other to create strong opinions. And I would add here, there's no allegation that Justice Roberts was somehow trying to arm twist for a particular outcome. All the justices on the Supreme Court have the same amount of agency. It's not as though Justice Roberts exercises some kind of leverage, or can offer the justices, a fancier office if they go his way. He's not building any bridges in their hometown. So this is really only a matter of persuasion, and that is not news.
All right. Colin and Kim, thank you very much. We're going to see how this Supreme Court story unfolds, particularly as the new court season begins. I want to thank everybody for listening. We've got 50 days now until Election Day, and promises to be wild and woolly.